He was barely 5 feet tall, but when little Jimmy Dickens stepped onto the stage of the Grand Ole Opry, he became larger than life. With rhinestone suits that shimmered like fireworks and a voice that could punch through any radio static from coast to coast, Jimmy wasn't just a country singer. He was a symbol, a living, breathing piece of Americana. For over 7 decades, fans adored him. They laughed at his quick wit, sang along to his novelty hits, and watched him become a fixture of the Opry family, always grinning, always shining. But behind the sequins and smiles, behind the cheerful stage banter and self-deprecating jokes, was a life filled with quiet struggles, and a final chapter no one expected. Long after his passing in 2015, the public tributes ended. But the questions? They never did. Because in the shadows of his stardom, a disturbing mystery unfolded. A mystery involving missing money, questionable legal documents, erased messages, and people who claim to love him, but may have taken everything. To understand how it happened, we have to go back to the hills of West Virginia, where a coal miner's son dared to dream beyond the darkness. Before he was little Jimmy Dickens, the rhinestone cowboy of the Grand Ole Opry, he was just James Cecil Dickens, the oldest of 13 children born to a struggling coal miner in the rugged hills of Bolt, West Virginia. Life in the Appalachians was hard. The family lived in a cramped wooden house with thin walls and no electricity, where winters bit through blankets and summers offered little relief. But Jimmy wasn't one to complain. He grew up helping with chores, hauling water, and learning early on what it meant to do without. They had no television, no phone, and often not enough food. But they did have a radio. And that scratchy speaker sitting on a kitchen shelf became the window to a world far beyond those coal-dusted hills. Every night, the family would gather around it like it was sacred. It was there Jimmy first heard the haunting yodels and lonesome blues of Jimmie Rodgers, and something inside him lit up. He wasn't just listening. He was studying, mimicking the phrasing, learning how to feel every line. By his teenage years, Jimmy had found his voice. It was high-pitched, unmistakable, and carried a surprising weight for someone barely taller than 5 feet. He began performing on local radio stations under the name Jimmy the Kid, often hitchhiking or borrowing cars to get from one broadcast to the next. With a guitar slung across his back and a battered suitcase filled with dreams, Jimmy worked the small-time circuit, county fairs, schoolhouses, roadside bars, anywhere someone would listen. But even then, something stood out. It wasn't just his music. It was his presence. Jimmy had a sharp wit, a fearless charm, and a way of laughing with the audience, not at them. He would joke about his size before anyone else had the chance to, deflecting prejudice with punchlines. He wasn't trying to be famous. He just loved the music. Loved the feeling of a crowd going quiet for a ballad, then roaring back for a laugh. Still, the road was rough. Jimmy often slept in his car, sometimes on park benches, and once, according to an old friend, inside a closed-up hardware store in exchange for singing at the owner's daughter's wedding. He lived show to show, dollar to dollar, but he never lost that spark, that stubborn belief that he belonged on a bigger stage. And as it turned out, he did. By the late 1940s, Jimmy Dickens had made enough noise in small-town radio to catch the ears of some of Nashville's most influential players. But it wasn't just his voice they noticed, it was the way he owned a stage. Word reached Roy Acuff, a towering figure in country music and a cornerstone of the Grand Ole Opry. Acuff saw in Jimmy what few others had recognized yet. Raw talent, charisma, and a flair for performance that couldn't be taught. With Acuff's encouragement, Jimmy made the move to Nashville, a town that either makes you, breaks you, or forgets you entirely. The Grand Ole Opry was the heart of country music, broadcasting across the nation from the hallowed Ryman Auditorium. Getting a slot on that stage was the dream of every aspiring performer. And in 1948, Jimmy made his Opry debut. The moment he stepped into the spotlight wearing a custom rhinestone suit designed to reflect every flashbulb and every footlight, something clicked. The crowd erupted in laughter and applause, not just for his size, but for his swagger. He was the unexpected delight of the night. But success didn't come easily, even then. Some in the industry still viewed him as a novelty act, a funny little man with a guitar. So Jimmy leaned in. If they wanted jokes, he gave them jokes. but behind the humor was a savvy songwriter and a cunning performer. He flipped the script. Songs like Out Behind the Barn, Sleepin' at the Foot of the Bed, and his breakout hit May the Bird of Paradise Fly Up Your Nose became massive successes, not just because they were funny, but because they were clever, relatable, and delivered with perfect comedic timing. Off stage, Jimmy was humble and easygoing, but on stage he was electric. He strutted, posed, and joked with a timing that rivaled the best comedians, while still delivering heartfelt vocals that reminded audiences he was more than a comic. He was a country music original. In 1965, he became the first country artist to circle the globe on a USO tour, taking country music to Europe and Asia, and proving that his charm could cross cultural lines. Yet for all the bright lights and applause, there was always an undercurrent of struggle. Jimmy wanted to be taken seriously as a musician, and as the genre evolved and younger stars entered the scene with slicker sounds and cleaner suits, Jimmy had to fight to keep his place. But he adapted. He collaborated with rising stars, embraced television, and maintained a grueling touring schedule into his 70s and 80s. He became more than a performer. He became a symbol, the embodiment of a bygone era of country music. Revered by legends like Hank Williams Sr., and later befriended by Brad Paisley, Jimmy served as a bridge between generations. Younger artists looked to him not just for mentorship, but for a reminder of what authenticity in country music really looked like. As the spotlight followed him into the 21st century, Jimmy seemed untouchable, an eternal presence at the Opry, a living relic who still made people laugh and cheer. But while the world saw the sparkle and the grin, the shadows behind the curtain were growing longer. As little Jimmy Dickens entered his later years, the laughter didn't stop, but something changed. While fans still saw the twinkle in his eye and the bounce in his boots, those closest to him noticed the slow erosion of control. His performances, once fiery and unpredictable, grew more scripted. His schedule, once filled with fan meetups and impromptu jam sessions, became increasingly guarded, and the man who used to know every stagehand by name started misplacing details, forgetting conversations, repeating old stories without realizing. For many, it was easy to chalk it up to age. After all, Jimmy was pushing 90 and had spent the better part of his life under hot lights and on the road. But those paying closer attention saw something more troubling. Jimmy wasn't just slowing down. He was being redirected. Handlers appeared seemingly out of nowhere. New assistants took over long-standing roles. Gatekeepers began filtering who could see him and when. At the same time, strange decisions began surfacing. Properties he had owned for decades, homes, land, even storage units containing memorabilia, began changing hands. Some were sold under LLCs tied to unfamiliar names. Others vanished entirely from public records. Vintage guitars from his private collection, including one signed by Hank Williams, were rumored to have been quietly sold to private collectors. Yet no press releases were made. No fanfare. Just silence. Behind the scenes, legal documents were being updated. Slowly, methodically, powers of attorney were shifted, estate plans amended. In one particularly unusual move, access to Jimmy's bank accounts, once overseen by a trusted financial advisor, was transferred to a third-party entity with no long-term ties to Jimmy or his family, at least not on paper. But perhaps most unsettling was the sudden withdrawal of long-standing friends and fellow Opry members. People who had been constants in Jimmy's life were no longer seen backstage. When asked, some admitted they'd been turned away or told Jimmy wasn't up for visitors. Others said their calls went unanswered for weeks, then months. A man once surrounded by a vibrant community had become isolated, physically and emotionally. Meanwhile, Jimmy's public image remained perfectly intact. He was still featured in Opry promos, still cracked jokes on special appearances, still wore the suits and smiled the smile. But beneath the sequins, he was becoming a ghost in his own life. And as the spotlight dimmed, the people now standing closest to Jimmy weren't family. They weren't lifelong friends. They were new, quiet, legally empowered. And soon, they would hold the keys not just to his finances, but to his legacy. In the final stretch of his life, Jimmy Dickens still appeared on stage at the Grand Ole Opry. But now it was different. His jokes were softer, his movements slower, and his famous twang came with noticeable effort. He still wore the rhinestone suits and offered a signature wink to the audience, but behind the scenes, those who knew him best say something felt off. Jimmy, once fiercely independent and deeply involved in his day-to-day affairs, was gradually fading into the background of his own story. Close friends, some of whom had worked with Jimmy for decades, were quietly cut off. Rehearsals became closed-door affairs. Old Opry colleagues who used to drop by with coffee and conversation were told he wasn't available. Visits were canceled, calls unanswered, and access to Jimmy was rerouted through a new layer of management, people unfamiliar to the longtime Opry community. It wasn't just scheduling, it was control. Several accounts describe how even those closest to Jimmy's inner circle were kept at arm's length. One veteran Opry stagehand recalled showing up for a planned lunch, only to be intercepted by a handler he'd never seen before. Another friend, a fellow musician, drove hours to see Jimmy, only to be told through a closed door that Mr. Dickens needs rest. These were people Jimmy had once welcomed without hesitation. Now, they needed approval. Jimmy, it seemed, had lost the power to choose who surrounded him. And with that isolation came decisions. Major ones. Legal filings show that during this period, a wave of estate amendments were executed. A new trust was established, managed not by family or long-term advisors, but by outside figures linked to a private management firm based out of state. Bank records later revealed substantial financial transactions taking place during this time. Money moved, assets sold, and titles transferred under Jimmy's name, often without witnesses familiar with his long-standing preferences. Health-wise, Jimmy was deteriorating. Sources close to the Opry say he would sometimes arrive at events unsure of the time, confused by simple questions or uncertain about who was in the room. One staff member described a chilling moment during a backstage rehearsal when Jimmy paused mid-song and asked, "Where's Mona?" His wife, who had passed away nearly 3 decades earlier. It wasn't stage banter. It was a sign of just how much his memory had begun to slip. Despite the clear cognitive decline, Jimmy's signature appeared on multiple legal documents in his final year, documents that fundamentally shifted control of his estate, his music catalog, and his intellectual property. And with each signature, more of his world slipped away. By early 2015, Jimmy's presence at the Opry had become largely ceremonial. He was wheeled on stage for brief appearances, propped up for photo ops, then quietly escorted off before anyone could ask too many questions. The man who once toured the world on his own terms had become, in many ways, a passenger in the vehicle of his own legacy. And those at the wheel? They weren't driving toward tribute. They were steering toward ownership. When Jimmy Dickens passed away on January 2, 2015, the public tributes were beautiful. Artists poured out love. The Opry dimmed its lights. But what followed behind the scenes was anything but respectful. A small private memorial was held. No press, no cameras, no longtime Opry colleagues. Some who had worked with Jimmy for decades weren't even invited. Insiders whispered it wasn't about privacy, it was about control. Because something was happening. A safety deposit box, reportedly containing handwritten lyrics, unreleased recordings, and personal letters, was accessed just days after his death using a duplicate key. His guitar collection vanished from inventory. Royalties meant for the Dickens family were redirected to unfamiliar companies. And a former business partner, someone Jimmy hadn't worked with in over a decade, suddenly re-emerged, now in charge of large portions of his estate. 6 months after his passing, things took a turn. A paralegal in Nashville, Jimmy's distant cousin, began collecting documents, interviews, and testimonies. She uncovered a disturbing paper trail. Consulting fees paid to shell companies mere days after Jimmy's death, licensing rights sold to international buyers without the family's knowledge, private auctions selling off Jimmy's memorabilia under aliases, plans to create a hologram tour using Jimmy's image, something he opposed in life. Most shocking of all, a confidential deposition from a former assistant to the Nevada-based trust managing Jimmy's estate. She said Jimmy told her, "They want my name, not me. They want my songs, not my story." That story, until now, had been buried. What happened to Jimmy Dickens wasn't a sudden betrayal. It was slow, calculated, executed in the quiet corners of hospital rooms, dressing rooms, and boardrooms. The smallest man on the Opry stage was surrounded, not by friends and family, but by people who saw him not as a legend, but as leverage. They isolated him, erased him, and monetized his memory before the final note even faded. But now, with mounting evidence, public pressure, and insider testimonies, that erasure is being reversed. Plans for a Jimmy Dickens Foundation are underway, one that will preserve his catalog, protect future legends from similar exploitation, and remind the world who he really was. Because Jimmy wasn't just a punchline. He was a poet, a fighter, a man who rose from coal country with nothing but a voice and a dream. And no matter how many papers were signed in back rooms, his story will never be stolen again. If this story opened your eyes, help keep Jimmy's memory alive. Like this video, subscribe for more true stories from the world of music, and tap the bell so you don't miss a future upload. Little Jimmy Dickens may have been small in size, but in truth, he was towering.